They were already tightening the rope before anyone asked what really happened. And out here, that was how truth usually died, not with a lie, but with silence that no one cared to break. Ethan Cole stood on a rough wooden crate in the middle of Red Hollow, boots dusted in pale sand, hands loose at his sides, not tied, not shaking, just still. The kind of stillness a man learns when he understands that words won't reach people who have already decided who he is. The noon sun burned straight down, casting hard shadows under hats and across faces that watched him without blinking, some angry, some eager, most just certain, because certainty was easier than doubt. Someone in the crowd spat into the dirt and muttered something about honor, and the word carried more weight than the rope above Ethan's head, because in this land, honor didn't belong to one man. It belonged to everyone who believed they had the right to judge it. The sheriff stood off to the side, thumb hooked in his belt, eyes avoiding Ethan's, not weak enough to agree out loud, not strong enough to stop what was coming, and that kind of man was more dangerous than any outlaw. The wind moved through the street, lifting dust in slow spirals, brushing against the worn wood of the buildings, the hitching posts, the silent horses tied in shade, even the brim of Ethan's hat. But it didn't move him, not an inch. He looked out over the crowd once, not searching for help, not asking for mercy, just taking in the faces, memorizing the way people looked when they believed they were right. 3 hours earlier, the sky had been a different color, heavy with storm clouds rolling low over the canyon, the kind that turned daylight into something dim and uncertain. And Ethan had been riding alone, tracking a stray calf along the ridge when the first crack of thunder split the air. Most men would have turned back, headed for shelter, waited it out. But then came a sound that didn't belong to the storm, sharp and human, cutting through the wind like it had somewhere to be, and Ethan didn't question it, didn't weigh the risk. He just turned his horse toward the canyon and rode. The river below had swollen fast, dark, water crashing against stone, pulling branches, debris, anything it could claim. And in the middle of that chaos, he saw her, a figure caught in the current, fighting but losing ground with every second, her hands reaching, slipping, disappearing beneath the surface before breaking through again. He didn't think about who she was, didn't think about what it meant. He swung down from the saddle and stepped into the water, cold biting through leather and skin, the current pushing hard against his legs like it had a will of its own. But he moved forward anyway, each step a fight, each breath shorter than the last. When he reached her, she looked at him with eyes wide, not just with fear of drowning, but something deeper, something older, and he didn't understand it then, only that there was no time. So he grabbed hold, pulling her toward him as the current fought back, her soaked clothing heavy, dragging both of them down, the fabric stretching under his grip before giving way with a sharp tear that echoed louder in his memory than the thunder above. It didn't matter in that moment. Nothing did except getting her to solid ground. And somehow, step by step, he did, dragging her onto the muddy bank where the storm began to ease, leaving only the sound of rushing water and two people trying to breathe. He let go immediately, stepping back, hands open, giving her space like his mother had once taught him. Respect first, always, but she didn't move toward him. She moved away, clutching what remained of her clothing, eyes scanning the ridge above them with a kind of urgency he couldn't place. Ethan followed her gaze and saw them, figures outlined against the fading storm, still as carved stone, watching everything from a distance that turned truth into something else entirely. He raised his hands, said something calm, something simple, but the words fell flat between them, because what they saw was already enough. A man standing too close, a woman backing away. Fabric torn, fear written across her face, and out here, that was a story people didn't need explained. Back in the present, the rope brushed against Ethan's neck as someone adjusted the knot, and the crowd leaned. In just a little, waiting for the moment they believed would make things right, and Ethan closed his eyes for a second, not in fear, not in regret, but in quiet understanding, because he knew the truth wasn't gone. It was just late, and sometimes, out here, being late was the same as never arriving at all. The knot tightened slightly as the man behind Ethan adjusted it with careful hands, not cruel, not kind, just certain he was doing what needed to be done. And that was the part that settled. Heavier than the rope itself, because no one here believed they were wrong. A boy no older than 12 stood near the edge of the crowd, hat too big for his head, watching with wide eyes that had not yet learned how easy it was to follow others. And beside him his father kept his gaze fixed forward, jaw set, as if looking away might somehow weaken his place among the men. Ethan could hear the low murmur moving through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Fragments of sentences, pieces of judgment, none of them asking what really happened, all of them repeating what they thought they saw, and out here, repetition turned into truth faster than facts ever could. The sheriff shifted his weight again, boots scraping lightly against the dust, and for a moment his eyes flickered up toward Ethan, then away just as quickly, like a man who had already lost an argument with himself. Somewhere behind the line of men, a horse stamped against the ground, restless, sensing the tension that hung thicker than the heat, and the sound carried in a way that made a few heads turn, but not enough to break the moment that was building. Ethan let his gaze drift past them, past the wooden fronts of the buildings, past the narrow street that led out toward open land, and for a second, it almost felt like he was standing outside of it all, like he was watching another man take his place on that crate, another man waiting for a truth that might not come in time. Back by the river, the storm had begun to pull away, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and something quieter, something that settled into the bones of the land after chaos passed, and Naeli had not moved for several long seconds after reaching the bank, her breath uneven, her hands gripping what remained of her clothing as if it were the only thing keeping the world from shifting beneath her feet. Ethan had stayed where he was, a few steps back, giving her space, because he could see it now, the difference in her fear, not of him as a man, but of what his presence meant, of what it would mean if anyone else saw them like this. And that realization came too late to change anything. When she finally looked up at him again, her eyes held something steady beneath the fear, something that tried to speak without words. But before either of them could find a way through it, the figures on the ridge began to move. They came down slow at first, then faster, boots finding paths through rock and brush with the ease of men who knew this land well. And Ethan understood then that whatever had just happened between him and the woman by the river was no longer theirs to explain. He raised his hands again, palms open, the same way he had when he stepped back from her, the same silent language of peace he had been taught. But the men approaching did not slow, did not hesitate, their eyes fixed not on his hands, but on the space between him and the woman, on the distance that told a story they had already chosen to believe. Naeli spoke then, fast, urgent, her voice carrying across the narrowing space between them. But the words did not land the way she needed them to, not in a language they would accept, not in a moment where listening had already been replaced by judgment. One of the men pointed toward the torn fabric still clutched in Ethan's hand, and that was enough, more than enough, because evidence did not need to be true, it only needed to be visible. Back in the town, the crate beneath Ethan shifted slightly as he adjusted his footing, the rough wood pressing through the soles of his boots, grounding him in a place that no longer felt like it belonged to reason, and he could feel the eyes. On him, dozens of them, waiting, expecting something, maybe a plea, maybe a denial, maybe anything that would make this easier to carry, but he gave them nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew that anything he said would only be shaped into something else. The boy at the edge of the crowd looked up at his father, tugging lightly at his sleeve, as if to ask a question he did not yet have the words for, and the man did not look down, did not answer, because questions were dangerous in moments like this. Questions slowed things down, and no one here wanted to slow down long enough to be wrong. The wind picked up again, carrying dust across the street in a thin veil that softened the edges of everything, the buildings, the people, even the rope above Ethan's head. And for a brief moment, it felt like the world itself was hesitating, like it was waiting for something to step in, something to interrupt the path they had all agreed to follow. And then, from somewhere behind the line of men, a movement began, small at first, almost unnoticed, the kind of shift that could be ignored if no one chose to see it, but it was there, and it was coming forward, steady, deliberate, and closer with every second. The movement grew clearer with every step, parting the crowd, not by force but by presence alone, and men who had stood firm only moments ago shifted just enough to let her pass, as if something in the way she carried herself made resistance feel misplaced. Naeli walked forward without hurry, her pace steady, her gaze fixed not on the crowd, not on the sheriff, but on the man standing beneath the rope, and for the first time since this began, the noise began to fade, not because anyone had been told to be quiet, but because something deeper than words was demanding it. Ethan saw her before anyone spoke her name, saw the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair, saw the marks left by river water now dried against her clothing, and more than that, he saw the decision in her eyes, a kind of resolve that had not been there before, something that had formed between the riverbank and this moment, something that had chosen its path without asking permission. The sheriff straightened slightly as she approached, uncertainty flickering across his face like a shadow passing over stone, because whatever this was, it was not part of the order he had allowed to unfold, and men like him depended on things staying predictable. Someone near the front cleared his throat, ready to speak, ready to reassert the story that had brought them here, but the words did not come, not when she stepped into the open space between them all and stopped just a few feet from Ethan, close enough that the truth of what had happened could no longer hide behind distance or assumption. For a long second, no one moved, not the man holding the rope, not the boy watching from the edge, not even the wind that had carried dust through the street. And in that stillness, something shifted, something fragile but undeniable. Ethan did not speak, did not ask, did not even look away, because he understood that this moment did not belong to him. Not anymore. It belonged to her, to what she chose to do with the silence that had nearly taken his life. Back at the river, her fear had been tangled with something else, something he had not understood at the time, the weight of what it meant to be seen in that moment, the cost of being misunderstood in a world that did not offer second chances. And now that weight stood in front of him, no longer hidden, no longer running. She took one more step forward, and the sound of it, soft against the dirt, carried farther than any shout could have, reaching the edges of the crowd, reaching the men who had been so certain, and planting something unfamiliar in their certainty. The man with the rope hesitated, just slightly, his hands pausing as if waiting for someone to tell him what to do next. But no one spoke because no one had expected this. No one had prepared for the possibility that the story they believed might not hold together under her gaze. Naeli lifted her chin, her eyes moving slowly across the faces in front of her, meeting them one by one, not with anger, not with fear, but with something steadier, something that made it harder to look away. And when her gaze returned to Ethan, there was no confusion left in it, no hesitation, only clarity. The boy at the edge of the crowd leaned forward slightly, as if he could see better by stepping closer, as if this moment held something he did not want to miss, and his father finally looked down at him, just for a second, long enough to realize that whatever happened next would be remembered, not just by those who stood here, but by those who learned from it. The sheriff shifted again, his hand moving away from his belt, his posture no longer certain of its place in what was unfolding. Because control had slipped, not taken, but given away the moment he chose not to ask questions. The silence deepened, stretching between them like a line no one wanted to cross first. And then Naeli moved again, not back, not aside, but forward, closing the last of the distance between herself and the man they had already judged, and, as she did, the weight of every assumption in that street seemed to lean toward her. Waiting, watching, holding its breath for what she would do next, she stopped close enough that the dust between them settled into stillness. Close enough that the truth no longer had distance to hide behind. And for a moment, the entire street seemed to lean toward her without moving, as if every person there understood that whatever came next would either confirm everything they believed or break it apart piece by piece. Ethan did not shift on the crate, did not speak, his eyes steady on hers, not asking for rescue. Not expecting it, just present in the way a man stands when he has already accepted what others have decided for him. Naeli's breathing was calm now, not rushed like it had been at the River, not uneven with fear, but measured, deliberate, as if each breath carried a decision with it, and her hands, still marked faintly with dried river water and dust, lowered slowly to her sides, no longer clutching at anything, no longer hiding. A man near the front of the crowd took a half-step forward, ready to interrupt, ready to reclaim the story before it slipped from his control, but something in her posture stopped him. Not force, not threat, just the quiet certainty of someone who had already chosen her ground and would not move from it. The sheriff opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak, as if to restore order to a moment that no longer belonged to him, then closed it again when no words came that felt strong enough to hold. The rope above Ethan swayed gently in a breeze that had returned without warning, brushing against his shoulder like a reminder of what had almost happened, what still might, if silence continued to rule. Nayeli lifted her eyes again, not to the crowd this time, but to Ethan, and there was something unspoken there, something that passed between them without language, something that had begun at the river when he stepped back instead of forward, when he chose distance instead of control, when he gave her space even when he did not understand why it mattered. Back then, in the fading storm, she had seen something she had not expected, not just a man pulling her from the current, but a man who knew when to let go. And in her world, that mattered more than strength, more than speed, more than survival itself. Now that memory stood in front of her, tied to a moment that had nearly erased it, and she could feel the weight of every eye on her, waiting, judging, expecting her to confirm what they believe because that would be easier, cleaner, simpler for all of them. The boy at the edge of the crowd leaned forward again, his small boots shifting in the dust, his eyes fixed on her as if trying to understand something he had never been taught, something no one had explained to him yet. Nayeli took one final step, closing the space completely, standing directly in front of Ethan, and the closeness of it made the air feel different. Heavier, like the space between two truths that could not both survive. Her gaze did not waver, not even when someone behind her whispered something sharp under their breath, not even when another voice followed, louder, urging her to speak, to confirm, to give them what they needed to finish what they had started. But she did not rush, did not react, because she understood something they did not, that once a word was spoken here, it would not be taken back, it would not be reshaped, it would become the only version anyone would remember. The sheriff shifted again, his hand now fully away from his belt, his posture uncertain, because control had slipped too far to be reclaimed with a single command. The rope creaked softly above, a sound that should have marked an ending, but now only marked the pause before something else, something no one had planned for. And then, slowly, with no hesitation left to carry, Nayeli bent her knees and lowered herself to the ground in front of Ethan. The movement steady, deliberate, undeniable, and the moment her knees touched the dust, the entire street seemed to exhale at once. Not in relief, not in understanding, but in the shock of seeing. Something that did not fit the story they had already decided was true the moment her knees touched the dust. The world did not break. It did something worse. It hesitated, and hesitation had a way of exposing everything people try to hide behind certainty. No one spoke, not the man holding the rope, not the sheriff, not the men who had been so sure just seconds ago, because what they were seeing did not fit the shape of the story they had already chosen, and without that story they did not know where to stand. Ethan felt the shift before he understood it, felt it in the way the air changed, in the way the weight on his shoulders eased without the rope moving, because something far heavier than the rope had just been lifted, something invisible, something made of judgment and assumption. Nayeli remained where she was, steady, unmoving, her head not bowed in fear, not lowered in defeat, but held in a way that carried intention, a gesture that meant something different where she came from, something that the people in this town did not yet understand. And that difference was the space where truth now lived. A man near the back let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been, as if the silence had made every small thing carry weight. The boy at the edge of the crowd stepped closer again, his eyes wide, not with fear now, but with something else, something like confusion turning into awareness, the first crack in a belief he had not chosen but had been given. The sheriff cleared his throat softly, the sound dry, uncertain, as if he was trying to remind himself that he still had a role to play. But the words did not come, because whatever authority he thought he had was now standing in the dust in front of him, and it was not his to command. Ethan looked down at her, not with surprise, not with relief, but with a quiet understanding that settled deeper than either, because he knew what it meant for her to do this here, in front of these people, in a place where her voice had not been asked for, where her truth had not been needed until now. Back at the river, when the storm had begun to fade, she had tried to speak, tried to explain, but the moment had moved too fast. The eyes on the ridge had already turned what they saw into something else, and words spoken too late had no place to land. Now here, she was not late. She had stepped into the moment before it closed, before it finished what it had started, and that was something none of them had expected. A man near the front shifted his stance, his boots grinding into the dust, as if he could anchor himself to the version of events he still wanted to believe, but the ground beneath him felt different now, less certain, less willing to hold the same weight. Nayeli lifted her head slightly, her eyes rising to meet Ethan's again, and in that simple movement, there was no accusation, no fear, only clarity, the kind that did not need to be explained to be understood. The rope above creaked once more, a hollow sound now, stripped of its meaning, because the moment it was meant to serve had already passed, replaced by something quieter, something harder to ignore. The man holding it loosened his grip without realizing it, his hands no longer certain of their purpose, because the act he had been preparing for no longer fit the truth standing in front of him. The wind moved again, softer this time, carrying the scent of dust and dry wood through the street, brushing against faces that no longer held the same expressions they had moments ago. Someone lowered their gaze. Another shifted back a step, small movements that spoke, louder than any defense, because they were not reactions to fear, they were reactions to realization. Ethan did not move from the crate, did not step down, did not reach for her, because he understood that this was not his moment to change. It was theirs, the crowd, the town, the people who had almost acted on something they had never truly seen. And in the quiet that followed, the kind that settles after something breaks open inside a room full of witnesses, the truth stood there in the dust, not loud, not forced, just present, waiting for each of them to decide what they would do with it. No one told her to rise, and she did not ask for permission. She simply remained there for one breath longer than the crowd could bear, then another, until the silence itself began to feel like a question that demanded an answer from every person standing in that street. Ethan could hear it in the way boots shifted against dirt, in a way someone behind him exhaled slowly, as if trying to release something they had picked up too quickly, something heavier than they expected. The sheriff finally took a step forward, not toward Ethan, not toward the rope, but toward the space where Nayeli knelt, his movement, uncertain, measured, as if he were walking into a truth he had not prepared for. And when he stopped, he did not speak at once, because even a man used to giving orders knew when words might make things worse. Nayeli lifted her eyes to him briefly, not in challenge, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if to say that what came next was no longer his to control. And that understanding settled into him like a weight he could not shift. A man near the front, one who had spoken loudest before, cleared his throat again, but this time the sound carried doubt, not authority. And when he opened his mouth, nothing came out that felt strong enough to hold the moment together. Ethan remained still, feeling the rough edge of the crate beneath his boots, feeling the rope loosen slightly above him, not because someone had decided to free him, but because the hands that held it no longer believed in what they were doing. Back at the river, when the storm had faded into a quiet that felt almost unreal, Nayeli had turned to him once more before the men from the ridge reached them, her voice softer then, slower, as if trying to find a way across a distance that language could not fully bridge. And though he had not understood every word, he had understood enough to know she was trying to give something back, something that could not be measured in simple terms. Now here, she did not need many words, because the gesture she had chosen carried more meaning than any explanation could survive in a place like this. She shifted slightly, placing her hand against the ground, steadying herself, then spoke, her voice clear but not loud. The kind of voice that did not push against silence, but settled into it. And though not every person there understood each word she used, they understood the shape of what she said, because truth, when carried without fear, did not need translation. The boy at the edge of the crowd took another small step forward, his father reaching out instinctively, as if to pull him back, then stopping, his hand hovering in the air before lowering again, because something inside him had begun to change as well. The sheriff let out a slow breath and finally turned, his head toward the man holding the rope. And in that look, something passed between them. Not an order, not a command, but a recognition that what had almost been done could not be undone, only stopped. The man's fingers loosened fully now, the rope slipping through them inch by inch until it hung with no purpose above Ethan's shoulder, swaying gently in the breeze like a thing that had lost its meaning. One by one, the men closest to the front began to step back, not in fear, not in retreat, but in the quiet discomfort of realizing they had stood too close to something they did not understand. Ethan watched them, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of distance that came from knowing this moment was not about him anymore. It was about what they would carry away from it. Nayeli rose slowly to her feet, not hurried, not dramatic, just steady, the dust falling from her knees as she stood. And when she turned slightly, her eyes moved across the crowd once more, not accusing, not forgiving, simply seeing them as they were now, without the story they had built around her. The wind moved again, softer still, carrying the weight of what had changed through the street. And in that quiet aftermath, no one rushed to speak, no one rushed to explain, because for the first time since this began, they understood that the truth had already spoken, and it had done so without asking for anything in return. No one moved to claim the moment. And that was what made it real, not the silence itself, but the absence of anyone trying to shape it into something easier to carry. Ethan felt the crate beneath his boots again, solid, ordinary, no longer a place between judgment and ending, just what under leather. And for the first time since the rope had been placed above him, he let his shoulders ease, not in relief, but in quiet recognition that something had shifted beyond him. The sheriff stepped closer now, his boots slow against the dirt. And this time when he looked at Ethan, he did not look away. There was no authority in it, no command, just a man trying to stand where he should have stood from the beginning. He reached up, not hurried, not dramatic, and lifted the rope from Ethan's shoulders, the fibers rough against his hands. And for a brief second he held it there, as if weighing something unseen, then lowered it to his side where it hung without purpose. A murmur passed through the crowd, softer than before, not the sharp edge of certainty, but the low sound of men who had begun to understand the cost of being wrong in front of others. The man who had spoken loudest earlier shifted his stance again, then stepped back, his eyes no longer fixed on Ethan, but somewhere lower, somewhere safer, because meeting the truth directly required more than he had brought with him that day. The boy at the edge of the crowd looked up at his father again, and this time the man met his gaze, just for a second, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them, something that would not be named, but would not be forgotten either. Nayeli stood a few steps away now, no longer at Ethan's feet, no longer at the center of their judgment, just a woman in the open air, her presence unchanged except for the way it now held the space around her instead of being held by it. She did not look back at the crowd again, did not wait for apology or explanation, because she understood something they were only beginning to learn, that truth did not need agreement to remain true. Ethan stepped down from the crate then, the wood shifting slightly as his weight left it, the sound small but carrying, marking a transition no one had planned for. And when his boots met the ground, it felt no different than it had that morning, which made the moment all the more real. He did not dust himself off, did not adjust his hat, did not speak. He simply stood there for a breath, then turned slightly toward Nayeli, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to ignore her, just enough to acknowledge what had passed between them without placing it into words. Back at the river, after the storm had broken and the men had begun their descent from the ridge, there had been a moment when she could have run, could have disappeared into the land that knew her better than any town ever would. But she had not, and that choice now stood in front of him as clearly as the ground beneath his feet. She met his glance for a brief second, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of gratitude, not of obligation, but of recognition, the kind that exists between two people who understand something without needing to name it. The sheriff cleared his throat again, this time finding his voice, but when he spoke, it was not loud, not commanding, just enough to reach those closest to him, telling them it was over, telling them to step back, to give space. And the words moved outward slowly, carried by the same wind that had once carried judgment through this street. One by one, the crowd began to break apart, not all at once, not in any clear order, but in small decisions made by individuals who no longer wanted to stand in the same place they had stood before. Some walked away quickly, eager to leave the moment behind. Others lingered, unsure of where to go next, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath them. Ethan watched them go, not counting, not measuring, just seeing, and in that seeing, there was no triumph, only a quiet understanding that what had happened here would travel further than any of them realized. Nayeli turned then, her steps steady as she moved toward the edge of the street, toward the open land beyond the buildings, and no one stopped her, no one called out, because there was nothing left to take from her and nothing left to give that had not already been given. The wind followed her as she walked, lifting dust in soft lines behind her, and for a moment, the entire town seemed to watch her go, not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with something slower, something that would take time to understand, if it was understood at all. Ethan remained where he was for a few seconds longer, then turned in the opposite direction, not toward the center of town, not toward the men who had almost ended him, but toward the quiet edges where things were simpler, where a man could stand without being turned into a story. And as he walked, the rope still hanging from the sheriff's hand behind him, there was a feeling that settled over the street, not loud, not spoken, just present, the kind of feeling that stays long after the dust has settled, reminding those who were there that sometimes the loudest judgment is not the one that echoes, but the one that falls silent when the truth finally arrives. The town did not return to normal right away, because normal required forgetting, and forgetting was not something that could happen while the dust still held the shape of what had just taken place. Men drifted back toward doorways and hitching posts, but slower now, their steps no longer, carrying the same certainty, as if each one was measuring the ground before placing his foot, unsure of what might give beneath him. The sheriff stood alone for a moment longer in the center of the street, the rope still in his hand, its weight different now, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with fiber or not, and he looked down at it as if seeing it for the first time, not as a tool, but as a choice he had nearly allowed to be made without question. He coiled it slowly, not out of habit, but out of something closer to respect, then carried it toward the office, his steps quiet, his shoulders lower than before. The boy lingered where he stood, watching the empty crate that had been left behind, the rough wood catching the sunlight. And for a long second he did not move, as if trying to understand how something so ordinary could have held something so heavy just moments ago. And when his father finally placed a hand on his shoulder, it was not to pull him away, but to stand with him, both of them looking at the same spot, both of them knowing something had changed, even if neither could say exactly what. At the far edge of town, where the buildings thinned and the open land began, Nayeli walked without looking back, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, but there was a quiet shift in the way the air moved around her, as if the land itself recognized her return to it, not as someone passing through, but as someone who belonged. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant water, and for a moment it felt like the river was still close, like the echo of that storm had followed her here, not in sound, but in memory. Ethan reached the edge of the street, at nearly the same time, stopping just short of the open ground, his gaze resting on the horizon where the land stretched out without boundary. And for a second, he simply stood there, letting the quiet settle into him, letting the absence of voices, of judgment, of expectation, take its place. He did not call out to her, did not close the distance, because he understood that what had passed between them was not something to be followed, not something to be claimed. It was something that had existed in a moment and would remain there, complete on its own. She paused then, not turning fully, just enough that her profile caught the light, and in that brief pause, there was an acknowledgement, not spoken, not prolonged, just present, a recognition that did not ask for anything more. Then she continued on, her figure moving into the wider land until the details softened, until she became part of the horizon itself, a line between earth and sky that no one in town could define but all of them would remember. Behind Ethan, the town began to find its voice again, quiet at first, then slowly building, not with the sharp edge it had carried before, but with something more cautious, more measured, as if each word now had to pass through a different kind of weight before being spoken. A man leaned against a post and shook his head slightly, not in denial, but in reflection, while another removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, staring down at the ground as if searching for something he had dropped without realizing it. The crate remained where it had been placed, untouched, unclaimed, a small piece of wood that now carried more memory than purpose, and no one stepped forward to move it, as if leaving it there was the only honest thing to do. Ethan turned at last, not back toward the center of town, but along the edge where the buildings gave way to open space, his steps unhurried, his posture the same as it had always been, because the moment had not changed who he was, it had only revealed it to others. As he walked, the sound of his boots against the dirt blended with the soft movement of wind. The same wind that had carried judgment hours ago, now carrying something else, something quieter, something that did not need to be named to be understood. And in that quiet, the town of Red Hollow held onto a moment that would not leave easily, a moment where certainty had cracked, where silence had spoken, and where the truth had arrived not with force, but with the simple courage of someone who chose to stand, step forward, and be seen days past. But the silence did not leave the town the way noise usually did. It stayed in the corners of conversations, in the pauses between words, in the way people looked at one another before speaking, as if weighing something unseen. The crate remained in the street for a long while, longer than it should have, not because anyone forgot it, but because no one wanted to be the one to move it first, as if touching it meant admitting how close they had come to something they could not take back. The sheriff kept the rope inside his office after that day, not hung where tools were kept, but folded, and placed in a drawer that he did not open often. And when he did, it was not to use it, but to remember the weight of a decision that had almost been made without question. The boy began asking questions in the days that followed, quiet ones at first, then more direct, questions about what people saw and what they believed, about how a man could stand in front of others and still not be heard. And his father did not always have answers, but he did not turn away either. And that was a beginning. Men who had stood in the front that day spoke less loudly now, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had learned that certainty could break. And when it did, it left a mark that could not be easily covered. At the edge of town, the land stretched the same as it always had, wide and open, holding its own truths without needing anyone to speak them. And sometimes, in the early morning or late in the evening, a few would walk out there, not for any clear reason, just to stand where the air felt different, where the memory of that moment seemed to settle more clearly. Ethan did not stay in town much after that. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but because he had never been a man who belonged to places that needed explanation. And when he rode the same way he always had, steady, quiet, carrying nothing extra, leaving nothing behind. Those who saw him in the weeks that followed noticed something they could not quite name. Not a change in him, but a change in how they saw him, as if the same man now stood in a different light, one they had not recognized before because they had not been looking for it. As for Nayeli, she did not return to the town, and no one expected her to. But sometimes travelers spoke of seeing a woman near the river or along the ridge, moving with the land instead of against it. And those stories were told without exaggeration, without the need to add anything, because what had already happened was enough. The wind still moved through Red Hollow the same way it always had, lifting dust, brushing against wood and stone, carrying sounds from one end of the street to the other. But there was something in it now that had not been there before. Something quieter, something that seemed to slow people just enough to think before they spoke. The crate was eventually moved. The street returned to its ordinary shape, and life continued in the way life always does, with small routines and passing days. But the memory of that moment did not fade the way other things did. It settled deeper, becoming part of the place itself. Sometimes, when the sun sat high and the shadows fell short, someone would glance toward the center of the street and remember how close everything had come to ending for the wrong reason. And in that remembering, there was no need for words, no need for explanation, just a quiet understanding that stayed with them. Out here, far from cities and far from laws written on paper, people learned in different ways, sometimes through hardship, sometimes through loss, and sometimes, rarely, through a moment when everything stopped just long enough for the truth to be seen. And in Red Hollow, long after the dust had settled and the wind had moved on, that truth remained, not as a story told for effect, but as something simpler, something carried in the way people stood a little longer before judging, in the way they listened a little more before deciding, because out here, justice did not always come with noise. Sometimes it arrived quietly, and sometimes it only needed one person brave enough to step forward and let it be seen.